stories don't define you. How you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and chief story maker of Elkins Consulting. We share stories for many reasons, to persuade, to entertain, to connect. What we sometimes forget is the impact of the stories we tell ourselves. Whether you're sharing personal stories or business stories, how you share them makes a difference in how you remember them and in how you're perceived by the people you're interacting with. When you figure out which stories to share, difficult bosses and coworkers, successes, failures, the next step is to develop how you share them. Have you figured out your patterns, your roles in those successes, the discomfort and your challenges? In this series, you'll hear stories that will resonate with you. You'll nod your head in understanding, and then we'll dig into the lessons from each of those. How many times have you been sharing a story only to be interrupted by a person eager to share his own? When I'm working with clients on communication skills, I remind them to listen for understanding, not to respond. But during this podcast, I'm asking you to listen and consider your own related stories, to listen and consider which stories in your life might have impacted you in a similar way. This podcast episode of Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Tell Them Will, is kind of exciting for me because I've been connected with Thom for a long time on LinkedIn, and this is the first time we've seen each other face-to-face using Zoom to record this podcast episode. But we've been connected for such a long time, and his writing has always been inspiring to me, but not just inspiring, but entertaining, insightful. So I'm just so excited to have you on the podcast. So thank you for joining me, Thom.
Happy to be here.
So Thom called in from Nova Scotia up in Canada, and I was surprised to find out that he's actually 3 hours ahead of Montana time. So he's actually ahead of New York by 1 hour, which means you're even further east than New York. And yeah. I didn't realize that. So what's interesting is we are both connected to Chris Spurvey, who wrote It's Time to Sell, which is a book that definitely impacted a lot of how I do things and how I think about my life. But Chris is actually 3.5 hours ahead of us.
Yeah, I shouldn't say strange, but Newfoundland's in their own little zone there, 30 minutes ahead of Nova Scotia.
They really are. I've never known anyone that was like a half hour in a time difference.
When we flew there, we almost were late for my son's graduation because we were sitting in the hotel room. My son said, "What time is it?" I said, "Well, it's 8:30." And he said, "Okay, we still have 30 minutes." And 9 o'clock came, and suddenly I said, I forgot the 30-minute time difference. But I mean, his graduation didn't start till 10, so we got there on time. But
good. Yeah, that would be a little strange. That's so funny. So I invited Thom to join me on this podcast because he has some really interesting stories about the place where he works. And it's a place that is really kind of an anachronism in time because there aren't many manufacturing plants quite like what you do where you are. And I just find it fascinating because it's so unusual in the current time to have a job like what you do. And I love it. I love the idea. It reminds me of the craftsmen that are recreating things like hand blacksmithing tools and the woodworkers that I know that are craftsmen. They're not just building furniture, they're building heirloom furniture. And it's kind of a blast from the past. It's an anachronism. So can you tell our listeners a little bit about what you do?
Well, I repair and maintain the knitting machines at a 160-year-old textile mill in Truro. It didn't start in Truro. It started in Prince Edward Island. And at one point it moved into Truro in a different building. In 1910, they built part of the present-day building. And it's been operating in that since then. I mean, yeah, there's parts of the floor, the beams, the ceilings are all still there from when it was built in 1910. I can see further on in the room where there was an addition made in probably the 1920s to the room where the building was expanded. We're on the third floor, but basically I just keep the machines going, and sometimes I run them depending on the machine. Sometimes it's easier for me to run it than have someone else to run it if it's a particularly touchy machine. But
so a knitting machine that knits what?
Fabric. So from t-shirt material to underwear material. They're circular knitting machines. So they knit a tube, which is then laundered and sent to cutting, where it's basically stamped through like a cookie cutter, where the
Wow.
patterns are cut out and sent on to sewing. So
And
we are
how,
unique even in Canada in the sense that everything is in-house in our mill. We have a cutting room, we have a dye room, we have a laundry, we have sewing. So from the yarn to the finished fabric, we do everything in-house. Some of
and the
it's sent
knitting,
on when we can't keep up, but otherwise it's all done by us.
wow. And the knitting machine is how old?
Well, there's about 80 or more knitting machines. The oldest one that we have that's still in use is, I don't know, really. Probably the oldest one, my machine number 10 is number 10. Anyways, the oldest one is maybe going on 50 years old. I'm not sure.
50 years old.
Most of them are newer. The newest one just came in from Monarch in the Carolinas 3 years ago. And
Wow.
that's just 3 years old. We make a lot of stuff for LL Bean on that machine. But
That's so cool. I guess the reason I'm so fascinated by it is that it's not something that we see. It's kind of like when we moved from Washington, D.C. to Montana, somebody I met invited me to go to her small farm and get eggs. And I didn't go over and get a dozen eggs from a carton. I actually went with my kids into her little
coop.
chicken coop area. She had a coop plus a fenced area and picked up eggs out of nests. And I remember thinking, I don't think I'd ever done that before because I was raised in cities. I never had chickens in my life. And so I was having this experience. Here I was, I don't know, in my mid 30s, getting chickens from the eggs nests and our little boys picking them up out of the nest. And then our other friend invited us to go and pick raspberries from his garden. And he shoveled out garlic for us so that we could take garlic home. And we had gardens where I was growing up, but these are like active farms and ranches, and where people around me are cattle ranchers. So I see the meat. I have seen a slaughter experience because I felt like I needed to. If I was going to eat meat, I needed to be able to see what they did.
Yeah.
And it was heartbreaking. I almost became a vegetarian. I don't think I'd have them coming to your knitting machines. There's nothing that would turn me off about wearing underwear, I guess.
No, there's nothing. No.
But the concept is still the same, seeing it at work.
Yeah. When I first started at the mill, we still would bring the wool in. They had bales of wool that would be in the far building, and they had machines that were more than 100 years old that would spin the wool into yarn, and then mostly it was used in hosiery being the sock machines in a different department than mine, where it would get knit into socks. But that since has been it's not there anymore. But the machines that spun it into yarn were pretty amazing. They had belts that went up to the ceiling from the floor, and it was, every time I came in, there was an old fella there with 3 fingers missing. He lost them in the machine, and he used to run the machine, and it was quite something.
Wow. And where did they get their wool? Was it local?
Originally, a lot of it was local. When I started working there, most of it was brought in from, I forget, Bulgaria, I think is where we get it now, already knit, already spun into yarn. Now we don't make socks anymore, but we still make coarse fabric. It's like the sock monkey sock yarn.
Right.
Anyways, we still knit that in the knitting room. We have coarse machines that run that thick wool. But yeah, most of it comes from Bulgaria, and I think our wool came from Eastern Europe somewhere. Not from, there is one country that uses slave labor. It didn't come from there. But
wow.
But the room where I leave to go to my car used to smell like a barn because of all the wool sitting back there. And every time I walk through there, I still see Keith Maxwell over there by the machine with his fingers missing. It's hard to forget those images when you've seen them. It's too bad. I hated to see the old machines go, but that's just They had to make
But
changes to
yeah,
survive, right? So,
of course, of course. But they're still doing what they're doing, and I'm just so impressed by that, the changes that they've made. And what I'm especially excited about with what you bring to the table in terms of this podcast is your stories that are analogies for the knitting machine, that any of those knitting machines that you worked on. One time you wrote about replacing a needle, and you used it as an analogy for taking the time to fix something that's broken rather than the disposable lives that we generally live.
yeah.
So, can you tell me a little bit about that? Do you remember it at all?
I'm trying to think. That might have been one of the first articles I wrote was needles in the cracks. I think I might have deleted it actually. At one point, I went and deleted a whole bunch of articles that I first wrote, but
That's so sad.
that one
That's how
might
we
still.
met.
Yeah, well, but at the time, my company really needed to make changes, and I wrote some very pointed articles. I think you pointed out to me at one point, and they. I don't feel bad about the articles, but things have changed and things have moved on, and my articles had moved on, and the relevance was gone. So I deleted them
Mhm.
because I didn't want them there as a record
Right.
anymore. So, but Needles in the Cracks, that's not the one you're thinking of. Needles in the Cracks was one time, I'll tell you the story anyways, because it's the only one I can think of. We had an old machine we were getting ready for a museum in town, and we no longer had the needles for them. I found out since we can still get the needles from England, but we had none on hand. But I asked my department manager where the machines used to sit, because we clean the machines, you blow off the machines with air, the needles invariably fall onto the floor, end up in the cracks of the hardwood because the whole room is hardwood flooring. And especially by the main support beams, which are about 1 foot by 1 foot, the needles build up in the cracks there, and nobody ever bothers taking them out. So I asked him where the machines used to sit, and I went and checked along the main support beam, and I found enough needles to fix the areas where the broken needles were to make the fabric look halfway presentable for a museum display. So I compared it to needles in the cracks, how there's people in our lives and in our society that have fallen through the cracks, been forgotten. They're just laying there on the floor,
Mhm.
and nobody's putting them to use. They seem like they have no use anymore, but we just need to find the right slot for them, the right place for them. They do have a purpose if somebody takes the time to find out where they're meant to be and what they're meant to do.
That's yes. It just reminds me of the very first part of this conversation, which was that um, there are craftsmen out there that maybe 100 years ago that would have been a dime a dozen, but now finding a craftsman that builds furniture. There's a guy named Al Swanson here in Helena, Montana, and he does a lot of fly fishing gear, like fly rod cases and fly boxes, for the lures that we fly fish with, and they're stunning. They'll have like inlaid stone and kinds of color, and they're just stunning. But he also does this furniture. I can't even describe it. It's so beautiful, and I'll put a link to his website in the blog post associated with this podcast. But when you think about it, there are so many people that really don't belong in college. That's not really of interest to them. And they're like that needle that kind of has fallen down that support beam right out of school because they haven't found their niche yet. And if
Yeah.
they could find something that really, that they could create something beautiful that would contribute artistically and in our heritage, keeping our heritage alive and our cultures alive. That's what I think of when I think
Yeah.
of people who do that, people who fix old cars.
I remember when we moved back here, I was 30 years old when we moved back to Canada from Japan. And so I had 10 years of teaching English experience, but no degree because I moved there when I was just turned 20. So I'd go apply for jobs and they'd look at my resume. They'd say, okay, you taught English for 10 years. They
Now
didn't
what?
want to hire me, right?
Right.
Because you're an English teacher. Why do you want a job at a factory? But Stanfield's was the only place still in those days they were even more old-fashioned than they are now. But if you went there at 8 o'clock in the morning, they gave you an interview. So I went in, I got on right away, and it was piecework, the back shift, and I started working. But I remember before I got on, I remember walking by and thinking, wow, that would be a cool building to work in. I thought I could imagine wearing one of those old hats, you know, and carrying a metal lunchbox to work and walking in through the doors in the morning. And I didn't really think I'd end up working there, but I did. And I really didn't imagine I'd be there for 19 years, 18 years, something like that.
Oh my gosh.
I am. So, yeah. And it's a crazy place. It's been crazy, and it still is crazy in its own different way. Different crazy now than it was before. But as for the craftsmen, it's different. Like a lot of the changes that have happened in my workplace over the last 2-3 years, there's been some major restructuring, and it's great. Most of it I really support. A lot of the problem is there's not necessarily the respect sometimes for what my job is, because a lot of the people who come in don't know about textiles. So they see all the jobs just as jobs, right? And they don't realize that it's not something that you can just take people in off the street and throw them on. Because most of the people at the mill who I work with, I'm not new anymore, but up till maybe 5 years ago, I was still the new guy. Because
After 12
everybody
years,
I've worked with had been there 30, 40 years. Most of the ones who retire are like 35 years, right? And so it seems like what they're doing looks simple to a casual passerby because they've been doing it for 35 years. They've never been formally trained. But we're finding out now it's not that easy to take people off the street and teach them these jobs.
Absolutely not. It's a craft.
Yeah.
It's definitely, I think about that a lot too, because I grew up in a printing plant, which is almost non-existent at this point. But my father was in printing and publishing, and I did hand bindery as a kid. And I remember walking in and seeing the pressmen and seeing the people doing quality control and opaquing microfilm, you know, like physically taking a marker or paint and taking the negative and fixing where there might be white where it should be black.
Yeah.
I remember those details and thinking, this is kind of mindless. But then I would see the people doing it and I would try to do it. And it was so much more attention to detail than I could do. Well, of course, I was 15 or 14, whatever it was. But still, I remember developing a completely different kind of respect for the people who work that kind of work.
Yeah, it's different.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Go ahead.
No, you go on.
Well, I wanted to talk about your pivot point that you wrote about a few years ago when you had decided that you were done with the plant because they were not respecting the craft that you had developed over 15 years. And so you started updating your resume and started looking for another job. And you had all these experiences that could easily apply to almost any other position because you had done everything from managing people to fixing machines to scheduling and all of the strategic planning when it came to doing projects. So tell me about that pivot point where you just went, okay, I'm done. And then the next pivot point where you ended up coming back.
Well, number one, my options are tied because my parents, now my mother is still here. And so that ties me to Truro. So all my decisions basically revolve around my staying in Truro at this point. So that limits my options. So my resume maybe looks good in a sense, and in another sense, my resume is very eclectic and meaningless because I taught English for 10 years. Maybe I was a manager of foreign staff for 10 years. But that along with knitting machine mechanic for 18 years really does me no good looking for a job. Not in the country anyways. Maybe in the city it would help me find a niche job somewhere, but here it would do nothing. So I took an online course because things were going nowhere. And I won't get into the details because everybody at work creeps me and I don't want to get myself in trouble by getting too personal about my workplace. But it was very dysfunctional for a long time. But because I really liked what I did, I don't care. Dysfunction doesn't bother me that much. It irritated me because nobody did anything about it. But I saw the end coming. I thought it couldn't go on any longer the way it was. And I thought it's better to start looking now than wait till there's 300 people out of work looking for work. So I took an online course through Vancouver Community College to work in the reprocessing room of hospitals. It seemed like a smart idea, and it was, I suppose. Although I'm happy I'm not washing bloody scalpels and whatever else they wash in the reprocessing rooms. But I did finish the course, and I applied for a job at the hospital, and my son gave me tips for my resume. He said to, put it in a folder, and he gave me all kinds of tips, and it worked. The fella at the interview said, "Wow, that's nice. Yeah, I like this." Anyways, so I had the interview, I had the job, and I would have taken it, but then I went to tell human resources, who I'd dealt with a few times over the years, about the dysfunction. But they were always helpful, but their hands were also tied,
of course,
by the way things were.
Issue.
Yeah, it wasn't on them. But anyways, then they asked what they could do to make me stay, and they did enough to convince me to stay. And so I'm still there. And I didn't want to leave to begin with. And then a year after I decided to stay, our present management resigned and a new vice president came on and cleaned house. And it was painful. Wow. I shouldn't say it happily, because it was painful for a lot of people, but it was needed.
Necessary.
And the cuts that were made were, for the most part, spot on. So, I mean, I felt bad to a point. At the other hand, part of me said, finally.
Well, I think what people forget is that this person who came in, if that person hadn't made the decisions they made, then instead of cutting 12 jobs or even 50 jobs, they would have lost 300 jobs.
Yeah.
Because eventually it was just not sustainable.
Well, there were people who came in and maybe worked an hour out of the day. I mean, one fellow in my department would come in. He had about an hour's worth of work in a day, and he'd sit in the back of the room with his shoes off, feet up, and he'd be there for about 7 hours, 6 hours out of the day.
Oh.
And nothing was ever done about it. And it got to a point where it was just, come on. We had like 12 people in the room, and at the most enough work to keep 4 or 5 people going. Right. And it was just, how do you keep funding this? We're not a social welfare organization, right? I mean, it's just not sustainable.
Right.
It was,
and especially, sorry.
No, it ties into old textile mill history. It was a very patriarchal, very familial built system, right? So the owners were the parents, the employees were the children. If you read the stories of the old textile mills, they were all much the same. But anyways.
Yeah. But if we want that to continue, if we want to have organizations, companies that do what they do, there are some things that you just have to address to make that sustainable, to make it possible. Especially now, as so much is being automated and mechanized. Our friend Larry Boyer calls it the fourth industrial revolution, where robots are really doing so much. And how do we make sure that we are relevant into the future? And again, it comes back to most of that kind of thing is going to be long gone in 10 years, 15 years, definitely in 50 years. But there will still be craftsmen, I would hope, that can continue those kinds of traditions.
Yeah, well, after the zombie apocalypse, I plan on taking out the oldest machine and setting it up in my garage and continuing to make underwear in my garage. So
nowhere to come when there's.
I'm not hopeful on seeing the fourth industrial revolution, but let's keep our fingers crossed that we'll see it happen.
Yeah, and in a positive way, right?
Yeah,
because it could be Terminator Industrial Revolution, but let's not go there.
Yeah.
So, just out of curiosity, when you decided to come back, do you remember the moment where you were kind of walking back in after saying, "Okay, I'll stay"? where you realized that you were in the right place, where it was just that aha comfort? I'm still learning, I'm still growing. There must have been a moment that you kind of felt so much relief that you stayed.
Well, I
Was
was
it a
relieved.
year later?
No, I was relieved right away because even as I threatened that I had the job, for me, my work, I'm so different than everybody on LinkedIn in the sense that my work isn't my all. I mean, my work is a way of funding my life. And I mean, we saved up for a house while we were in Japan. We bought our house with cash. It was paid for. We don't owe any money. And neither of us have expensive tastes. So I have everything I need. And so as long as my work gives me enough money to fund my life, I'm happy. And if
Mm-hmm.
my work is nice and I enjoy it, that's a bonus. And the idea of going to a hospital and working in a room with no windows, no hardwood floors, no wooden beams, no brickwork was weighing on my mind the whole time I was threatening to leave. But I thought, well, so I stay here and the place goes under in 2 years, then where am I? So I was
Right.
leaving with a heavy heart to begin with. I was threatening to leave with a heavy heart to begin with, but I would have carried out my threat because it seemed like the smart thing to do. So the second that she said, "Hey, what can we do to keep you to stay?" I breathed a sigh of relief right there and right then because I didn't want to leave. I love my machines. The idea of somebody else taking my machines because nobody, not many people like their job, even at the mill. A lot of people just
Mhm.
come, they work for their paycheck, they don't like what they do. And I like my machines. I know them all personally, and they like me back. And the idea of somebody else tinkering with them, somebody else not giving them oil when they need it, somebody else not cleaning them when they need to be cleaned irks me. So the idea of not having to leave them behind really was a big relief. I, yeah. So
So
it was
even though you
instant.
don't, right, so even though you don't define yourself by your job, you still have kind of a legacy you want to leave, and or you still have that sense of I don't know, I don't know really how to put that, but a sense of responsibility to your machines, even though you don't define yourself by your job.
And I think I was that way as an English teacher, and I think I was that way as a bag boy in high school. I think I was that way as a short order cook in junior high. I mean, what we do is a natural expression of ourselves, right? So what I do at work, how I am at work is a natural reflection of who I am as a person. So if I don't care for my machines, if I don't care about what I'm doing when I'm at work, then what does that say about my own personal life, right? What does that say about the details of my own life? Am I just doing what I need to do to get by? So I would like someone to see that I care for my machines, that I see that yeah, I don't know what I'm saying, but
No, it makes sense to me. It totally makes sense to me because it is what you do is a reflection of who you are. Even if you don't define yourself by your job, you definitely define your character by how you do it. And that's what
yeah.
I think you're
And I
saying.
think had I become a sterile reprocessing technician, somehow I would have found a way of liking that too. I mean,
Yeah.
I would hope, and being good at it. I can't imagine it, but mostly because I'm really in love with the building that I work in and my machines. I mean, so the idea of leaving it was really hard, but
Hmm.
I'm sure I would learn to love it, as I'm sure I'll learn to love whatever I do next, because I have little doubt that sometime before I'm finished working that I'll be doing something different at some point, but
And I'll be
who knows
so
what that is.
curious what's next for you. um, so, two more things before we wrap up. One is I love how you talk about the environment and how that is so important to you because it really resonates with me. I worked for, I think, about 5 years for the state of Montana in different cubicles in office buildings. And when I left my last job with the state, ended up working for the city. This was a few years, probably 6 or 7 years ago. I remember making a list of my priorities for my next job, and the top priority was environment. I had decided I will never work in another cube again. It's so dysfunctional to work in those cubicles. And when I walked into what was going to be my office with the city as being a public affairs specialist for the city, it's in an old building. It was originally a courthouse, and then it was a post office, and then it became the city and county building for administrative offices. So when I walked into my office, it was the former judge's quarters from the courthouse. And I had floor to ceiling, beautiful handmade bookshelves. And of course, most of the books were ridiculously old and unusable, but they were gorgeous. It looked like a library. And the windows are humongous. And I could look out my windows and see the oldest cathedral west of the Mississippi from my window. And I remember walking in there and thinking, okay, I could live here for a while because of the environment. So when you describe the old building, the hardwood floors, the beams, the bricks, I could feel that. I could sense that attraction to that environment. So tell me a little bit more about the environment where you work and why it's meaningful to you.
Well, number one, like I don't have a desk because I'm not a desk type of job, but I have a work table and I have a chair that I've hauled near my work table. And if I sit at my work table facing the windows, I've got a row of windows that are about 2 meters high, up and down the whole length of the building. And I can see the expanse of Truro laid out before me through those windows. If it's sunny, the sun shines in on me. If it's snowing, I can see the snow and the wind blowing outside. I can see everything that's going on right instantly. That's irreplaceable. Add to that all the hardwood floors that are meticulously maintained. Now I have to say the last 10 years they haven't done much to them, but I remember at one point they replaced whole sections of the hardwood flooring. Every few years they have brick workers come and replace sections of the brickwork on the outside of the building. The fire hoses on the wall must be about 100 years old, I'd swear. I don't know how old they are, but yeah, it's a very relaxing atmosphere. Even when you're busy, it's a very nice atmosphere.
I wish more organizations, more companies would pay attention to that. The detail of the atmosphere, the environment where people work. One of the things that I think we're really missing, especially in that kind of in the kinds of offices I was describing with the cubicles, is that the environment really does play a huge role in first of all, your ability to communicate well and be responsive to people, but it also impacts your productivity because I know when I'm in an environment that's comfortable, I work better. I work more effectively and efficiently. So
yeah, it's funny because they have the order office is on the second floor. I'm on the third floor, but the order office is directly below my fleece machines. But they had the order office built against the wall where there actually is big windows. But when they built the order office, for some reason, I guess to keep the heat from the sunlight heating up the smaller room so much, they plywooded all the windows in with cheap paneling. So you go in the order office, there's no windows, just a paneling size cubicle about the size of this room that I'm in with no windows and 2 photocopiers and about 5 little cubicles stuffed in this little room. And I'm always thinking, if I was there, I would take a hacksaw along and cut through that stupid paneling so I could see the windows.
Oh my gosh, that's crazy. As opposed to just putting blinds up.
Yeah, I don't know why they don't. Maybe somebody will creep me on this podcast and go in there and fix the windows for them because they should open at least one of the windows up for them. But
no kidding.
Anyways,
well, it changes how you work.
I couldn't imagine not being able to see outside. I'd need at least one window, and that's what really pained me about going to the hospital. Is I knew I'd be covered in plastic gowns all day long, right, and working inside a sterile environment. That would have been hard for me.
Yeah, that doesn't appeal to me at all. So one last question, because it's been asked before, and I'm sure I've heard the answer before, but I would love for our listeners to hear it. And just for our listeners, I will have a link to Thom's LinkedIn profile so that you can connect with him if you'd like, and a few other little details in the blog post associated with the podcast. You call yourself the Chicken Whisperer. Tell me the story.
Why do I call myself the Chicken Whisperer? Well, because I have chickens. I have 6 chickens. About 10 years ago or 8 years ago, my wife always hates birds. She still hates birds. But I always wanted chickens, but I didn't bother pushing it because I knew she hated birds. But one day, for some reason, she thought maybe it'd be neat to have chickens. So, hey, I went with it. I rolled with it and I said, hey, let's get chickens then. So we got chickens. And so I like to think my chickens understand me and I like to think I understand them. I don't know if it's true, but it seemed like a real, I don't know. Everybody sounds so professional on LinkedIn. It sounded at the time like a really great thing. Now there's all kinds of whispers out there. It's no longer as original as it was, but
Oh, I know. I've seen so many people change their titles to storyteller.
yeah.
I want to kind of strangle people when they do that without actually being storytellers. But that's, it's up to them what they call themselves.
Thing. And the
Eh,
Thinking Man's circular knitting machine mechanic is from Steve Ashby. I haven't seen much of him on LinkedIn these days, but he's the one who gave me that one. So, and
That
I
was a
thought
good
that
one.
was cool too. So I threw that on there.
I like that. It definitely represents you well.
Yeah, well, I thought it probably did.
Was there any time with your chickens that you talked to them and they calmed down, or was there something that really you felt like you were connected with them in some way?
No, but if I'm in the house and I'm drying the dishes, my wife washes, I dry. If I'm drying the dishes and even if I say it mildly in a mildly loud voice, if I say, "Hey girls," they'll hear me through the window somehow. I don't know. They must have awful good hearing because they'll all come run to the edge of the fence. Because usually around supper time, I'll throw the scraps from the table and the scraps from cooking out to them. So they must be listening around that time of the day for my voice, very attuned to my tone or whatever,
Girls.
because they'll always hear me if I call them. So
That's hilarious.
chickens are great. If you ever have a chance to have them, it's also nice for your table scraps because it feels so much nicer to throw it in the chicken run and have them happily gobble at it than throwing it in the compost bin. I mean, composting is
Yeah.
great, but chickens are even better.
Well, we have talked about getting chickens, but we travel too much. So until we decide not to travel as much or whatever we decide, I think we're
Yeah.
going to skip the chickens. But we live in a place where we can have them in the city limits. We're
Neighbors
not
are
allowed
always
to have
happy to look
roosters.
after your chickens for you if they can have the eggs while you're gone.
That's true. That's
Yeah.
true. I have friends that have given us eggs or that I've purchased eggs from, and they taste different.
Oh,
They,
yeah. The
oh,
yolks have a lot more texture to them. Like store
yes.
eggs or like McDonald's or Tim Hortons, I can't even stand to eat their eggs
Oh,
because it's just like goop. Yeah.
they don't have any flavor.
I mean,
They
I
don't
have
have
to
any
be honest, eggs aren't my favorite thing to begin with, but I do like a fried egg with bacon, probably bacon I like and the egg just by association. But I definitely don't like store eggs much. My home eggs are much better.
Oh, I bet they are. Tom, thank you so much for recording with me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Great to meet you. I know Jeffrey Phillips tried to touch base with me once, and I've never talked to him because you didn't ask me what nobody knows about me, but what not many people know about me is I get really nervous talking to people in an organized setting.
Mhm.
So even the idea today of talking to you, I was eating supper, I was nervous thinking, okay, I got to talk to Sarah today. Oh, I used to, if I'd read scripture in church or have to read in front of a group of people, I have an irregular heartbeat occasionally. And if I have to read in front of people, my irregular heartbeat will kick in. And I always think that would be a really stupid way to die because you're nervous about getting up in front of people and reading in front of them. So yeah, there's my thing. I'm not shy, but speaking in front of people unless I have a direct purpose. If I have a direct purpose, I'm fine. Okay, I got this to say, I'll say it. But to just randomly not know what I'm going to say, that's hard for me.
Wow. I can't believe I forgot to ask that question at the beginning of the podcast.
Well, there you go.
76 episodes, and I forgot for the first time.
My
That's
my cute
hilarious.
dog distracted you. So.
Yes, that's what happened. I got to see your dog. Well, Tom, as I mentioned to the listeners, we're going to have a link to your LinkedIn profile so people can connect with you. Is there anything else you want to say?
It's just a pleasure talking to you face to face, Sarah.
It has been a pleasure. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Share Them Will. Please visit my website for more podcast episodes, blog posts, and information about how I can help you develop and share your stories at elkinsconsulting.com.
Now listen to me, honey, while I say, how could you tell me that you're going away? Don't say